Welcome to the Chapter 1 lecture video on what is organizational behavior. Before we really dive into the topic of OB, it is important that we first define it. Organizational behavior, or OB, is a field of study devoted to understanding, explaining, and ultimately improving the attitudes, cognitions, and behaviors of employees in groups or teams in organizational contexts. One primary goal of OB is to maximize the output, specifically output in relation to entities, processes, and structures, to improve the overall effectiveness of the organization and its employees. Because OB is an applied behavioral science, it is built on the contributions of a variety of disciplines, including general psychology, social psychology, and IO, or industrial and organizational psychology. It is also built on other foundational disciplines, including sociology, anthropology, and economics. Importantly, almost all concepts in OB can be integrated into a singular model that highlights individual, group, and organizational factors. At the organizational level, the integrative model accounts for things like structure and culture, which are thought to predict individual level mediating mechanisms and outcomes like an employee's job satisfaction, their motivation, and their job performance. It also includes things like trust and justice and ethics and diversity, learning and decision making. So there's lots of topics that are covered holistically as part of your OB textbook. Now, OB also accounts for some external factors, for example, external market factors, global issues, including pandemics, world wars, natural disasters, but those external contingencies aren't modeled in the integrated model from your textbook. Instead, the integrative model focuses purely on within the organization factors rather than factors outside the organization. So we will cover much of the within organizational factors, but we will also cover things beyond this model as part of our discussions of trends within organizational settings or where organizations and OB research is going from here. Now, within the integrative model, the level of analysis is quite important. So when we talk about different phenomena throughout the class, I want you to recognize whether or not we are talking about individuals, groups and teams, or the organization more holistically. This is important because depending on level, how we speak about the phenomenon and how we address issues related to the phenomenon changes. So at the individual level, oftentimes we look at changing employee attitudes and behaviors or how employees perceive their environment. But those types of changes wouldn't manifest and operationalize the same way at the organizational level. At the organizational level, we have to change processes and rules and regulations and our formal policies and practices in order to have the same types of effects. Before we get into the weeds with what OB is, we need to first discuss the history of organizational behavior, and this extends beyond what your textbook covers. But it is important that we lay the foundation for where OB research has been and where it is going in the future, in order to keep us informed about how we view people, groups, and organizations now versus how we have done so historically. One of the first famous examples of OB research occurred in the 1920s and 1930s, when Western Electric factory in Hawthorne, Chicago, sought to examine how changes in environmental conditions impact employee productivity. So they were looking at things like, does changing the lighting of the office or the brightness of the office impact employee productivity? Does providing longer or shorter breaks impact employees' performance? They were looking at these minor tweaks in the environment, hoping that they could show that some changes were more impactful than other changes. To do so, researchers came into the office each day and they made small modifications to the work environment. And then they openly observed employees throughout the day, trying to keep track of any behavioral or performance changes. And interestingly, regardless of the modification made that day, worker productivity changed every single day the researchers were present. So I want you to take a second, pause this video, and think about why that might have occurred. What is happening that is initiating or eliciting this change in productivity level? Because it's clearly not just the small changes in the environment. So the phenomenon is known as Hawthorne or the observer effect. And what happens here is that individuals modify their behavior simply because they know they're being observed. So it didn't matter what was physically changed in the office. What mattered is the fact that these individuals knew that they were being watched. So they were being observed and they adjusted their behavior accordingly. Because they were being watched, some employees overperformed because they felt the pressure to impress. In other cases, employees underperformed because they felt like social anxiety and nervousness. Still others underperformed relative to their average because they avoided utilizing the shortcuts that people normally use that make themselves more efficient. So if I know I'm being watched by my supervisor, I might not engage in those little shortcuts that I do throughout the day. And in that case, my performance would be below par. So the real issue here isn't that these people were being that the environmental changes actually mattered. What mattered is that they were being observed by someone and they changed their behavior accordingly. And this is a monumental study in OB for several reasons, but because we now know that observation matters and the observer effect can be more impactful than other environmental conditions oftentimes. Now, in the 1940s, OB was almost entirely comprised of mathematical modeling and statistical analyses. These mathematical models and analyses took a purely quantitative or numbers-based approach to understanding organizations. So OB researchers at the time focused solely on impactful numbers like sales, return on assets, or your ROAs, return on investments, profitability, etc. So they wanted those firm numbers to help quantify and calculate successful behavior in organizations. Then in the 1950s and 1970s, the Carnegie School began to take more of an economic approach. With this economic approach, they focused on resource dependence and what is known as the resource-based view of the firm, which we will discuss shortly. Carnegie focused purely on the impact of resources in organizations. So the Carnegie or the economic approach wanted to understand why resources matter, which resources matter for organizational success, and then how resources and resource spirals can be accumulated over time. It was all about resources. And as part of this discussion, there was the consideration of something known as bounded rationality in decision making. And although we will discuss bounded rationality in detail in a later lecture video, the basic premise is that most organizations make decisions by satisficing rather than maximizing resources. That is, they make decisions that are satisfactory or just good enough rather than decisions that would maximize returns and subsequent resources. Since the 1980s and the Carnegie method, OB researchers have focused primarily on individuals. So we moved from mathematical modeling and statistics and quant-based analyses to focusing on economics and resources to now focusing on individuals themselves and the importance of employees as individual people, their unique perceptions, their values, their attitudes, their cognitions, their behaviors, their personalities, and such. All those individual level factors and how those factors impact organizational success. And typically we capture this type of information using qualitative methods, surveys, and observations. So you will see there is a real shift from numbers to resources to people themselves. So OB focuses largely on people. Now, if you have an interest in organizations more holistically, strategic management is a good alternative class to take, as taking strategic management will allow you to focus more on the macro stuff. Strategic management is macro oriented, so it focuses on more larger organizational processes and outcomes in general. So just like economics, marketing, and finance, the study of organizational behavior is extremely important for employees and for organizational success. Without OB, we wouldn't understand the internal factors that motivate employees and drive their behavior. We also wouldn't understand why some employees are more or less successful than others, or how employee knowledge, skills, and abilities impact organizations, and how employees develop knowledge, skills, and abilities at work. We wouldn't understand why employees behave the way they do or what makes leadership ineffective or effective. So OB does help answer a lot of questions, even well beyond the examples I mentioned. Rather than just providing examples of why OB matters, let us also discuss OB in terms of the resource-based view of the firm. So RBV argues that resources are most valuable when they create long-term benefits and a sustainable competitive advantage over competitors. When we talk about resources, resources can take on several different forms. For example, resources can be financial, which would include things like revenue, equity, return on investment, return on assets. They can also be physical, accounting for things like technologies or machineries, or they can be KSAs, those knowledge, skills, and abilities that employees bring to organizations or develop over time. And the resource-based view of the firm suggests that resources provide a sustainable competitive advantage only when they are rare, valuable, and inimitable. So they need to be rare, such that they cannot be easily obtained by competitors. They need to be valuable, such that they create long-term benefits for the organization. And this is typically in the form of profits, resource spirals, personal capabilities, favorable attitudes, etc. So there needs to be some type of benefit and value to the resource. And lastly, and arguably most important, resources need to be inimitable. This is that they cannot be imitated or duplicated by competitors. This is why employees are so important. Every employee is unique, bringing with them to the workplace a unique pool of KSAs, personalities, and qualities which make them inimitable in the workplace. So you are different than every other employee in your organization, which makes you rare, valuable, and inimitable to some extent. Now, that being said, not all your characteristics, qualities, and KSAs are desirable to every organization, which is why organizations look to select the best fitting employees. So all employees are unique, but it's the organization's job to find the employees that fill a valuable and important role within the company, or that employee, that uniquely fits what the company is looking for. And this is why we conduct fit analyses and look at relatability when we're making hiring decisions a lot of times. And overall, OB provides information on what types of employees, groups and teams, structural dynamics, pay and performance systems, etc., are most and least effective for creating a sustainable competitive advantage in different types of organizational behaviors and contexts, which is why it is important to understand why some organizations have a sustainable competitive advantage based on all these complex moving parts and contingencies of the organization. The individuals, the groups, the processes, the social and political dynamics, the communication patterns, all of that matters and more. Now, that being said, we can't make sweeping generalizations about all organizational members, organizations, or external markets for several reasons. In general, there are few, if any, simple and universal principles that explain all organizational behavior because organizations are unique and complex. They are also changing rapidly, so they change consistently in response to both the internal contingencies as well as the external market factors. So if we think about the global pandemic and how quickly organizations had to change in order to survive or remain relevant. Organizations are also socially complex, which means that they have to continuously account for cultural, social, socio-political, and group factors. And furthermore, organizations are all comprised of numerous people making numerous small decisions that cannot all be simultaneously predicted or accounted for. So the idea of numerous small decision is something that your textbook highlights, which is that there are so many decisions that happen at any minute within and outside the organization. And those decisions have repercussions on subsequent decisions, which can drastically change the landscape of organizations. Thus, it is impossible to account for everything. However, OB does an excellent job of summarizing common trends in organizations, mapping common employee characteristics, attitudes, and behaviors, and accounting for internal organizational dynamics and structures, as well as some external market factors. And in doing all of this, OB can make relatively accurate predictions about organizational behavior. Truthfully, it is sometimes difficult to apply OB principles to real-world organizations, not because the principles don't have application themselves. So it isn't that we can't apply them, but instead it's because many organizations don't believe in the value or importance of organizational behavior and employees. And of all those organizations that do value OB, many don't know how to consistently apply OB principles to their specific organization. So this problem is known as the rule of 1/8. Only half of organizations believe there is a connection between managing people and the profitability of that company. And only half of those who do see the connection will then attempt to make a systematic approach to comprehensive change. So the others will only make a minor change. And then half of the firms that make the comprehensive changes will persist long enough to reap some type of benefit. Thus, a half times a half times a half equals 1/8, which is the estimated number of organizations that believe, implement, and persist in the application of organizational behavior principles. So that does wrap up the Chapter 1 lecture video. If you have any questions, please email me either on Canvas or directly at samantha.jordan@unt.edu. Thank you.